son. And he's also on so many different things. And just an all-around wonderful person. So you need more introduction than
That's all
that, Theo, or is
Thank you too much.
that okay? But
You would have just said I'm your friend. That was.
well, we love him.
I love you. Oh, good morning, everybody. Good morning.
But can you click on got it there, Rebecca?
Oh, yes. Yeah, and then I will.
He knows how to do it.
After a few weeks ago, I was invited to speak about I know what I spoke about, but what
The policing in America.
right, policing in America. And so after that meeting, Alex and I were talking, and I said, you know, a topic that very few people really know and understand is this ideal of whiteness and what that is historically. You know, we have courses that talk about, you know, African American history, Asian American history, Native American history, Latinx history, but we don't have courses, you know, about the history of whiteness. It's like one of those mystery categories, and people just assume a lot about it. And the assumptions are generally, you know, grounded, you know, in this ideal that, you know, it was, you know, just, you know, these people who all came together and, you know, they created this structure and they're white and everybody else is not. And that's really simplistic. It's really simplistic. It doesn't say much. And actually, it's very harmful. It's very harmful. And it's harmful in the sense that, you know, people don't know their histories. They don't know their history. They don't know the real history of the nation. And I always say a half-truth is a whole lie. And we have not, you know, told the truth about the nation. And so now we're having this debate, right? And this debate, you know, we want to put this class in, we want to have students learn about this in our K through 12, and you have pushback, you know, on that. Who would have thought that we would be in the United States and talk about not teaching someone, you know, we want to deprive you of knowledge, of information. And that does not sound like the United States to me. That sounds like 1928, 1919, somewhere, you know, over in Europe, and somebody wants to march through and control what the masses think and say and do. And so I teach a class 7 or 8 years ago, 8 years ago, I decided to develop a course. I was teaching a sociology course about race and ethnicity for the college. But I really wanted a course that was more geared towards multiculturalism. Race and ethnicity is really something that's, you know, confined, you know, in a space, but I wanted a class about multiculturalism, typically, you know, guided towards criminal justice. It really was guided towards anyone, but I wanted to intertwine it with criminal justice. And so I developed that course, and, you know, you have to continue your own deep dive. And I had taken a deep dive, but I needed a deeper dive. And so you get more into anthropology, you get more into political science, you get more into sociology, economics. All of these things intersect. And it's amazing how they intersect. But I came across a book, and it's the one, well, all of these books I've come across, and they're all fascinating books. And working towards whiteness, how American immigrants became white. And people would see that, and they would think, what do you mean working towards whiteness? What is that? What do you mean how immigrants, became white? How Jews became white folks, the construction of whiteness, how the Irish became white, Nordic whiteness and migration. And then you have a couple of books, White Trash, The 400-Year Untold History of Class in America, Nancy Eisenberg, which is an excellent book. Whiteness of a Different Color, European Immigrants and the Alchemy of Race. The bottom left book is a book called White Boy, and it's a small book by a literary scholar on the East Coast named Greg Bottoms, and it's basically it's really a book about himself. It's like a memoir, but it's like a memoir about his journey through whiteness as a young white male, and now as a scholar, and the things that he has come to realize about his life and the construction of that life. But I think the most important, to me, book that's up there in terms of telling this story is by Nell Painter, who is that center book that says the history of white people. And Nell Painter is a professor emeritus from Princeton University. And this is one of her last pieces before she retired or became emeritus. And this really gives the history of whiteness and the development of it. And so many of the things that I was talking about, up front is her work and what she talked about. So what I'm going to do, because we have now an hour and 20 minutes, I'm going to just talk and take you through some slides. And so you can listen to me from back here, but really watch the screen. There'll be a lot of, there's some words, and you can read those slides for yourself, and I'm not going to read them verbatim, but I'll refer to them and read some of them maybe, because they got some important parts that I'm going to emphasize on. But I want you to, and you don't have pencil and paper, so you can't take, notes, but take mental notes and have your thought processes and questions ready for each other, not only for me, so we can have a discussion. So I'm going to try to get through this in about 40 minutes. And that will give us, almost, another 40 minutes so we can really discuss these things, and you can start even thinking about your life in your education, the way that you've been socialized, because we've all been socialized, to live in this society, in which we call, America, United States, world, the globe. David came in and said something, jokingly, as he always does. He said, I think I'm white, right? I think I'm white.
Those in the shower,
Right, right.
the white guy.
And so I said to him, well, that depends.
That's a good one.
It depends. And what I mean by that is, how do you see yourself? And how do you define yourself? It's different how the world defines you. And I can't even say the world, because if you step foot, in Italy, you go from white to being American. If I step foot from here, into Senegal, I go from, a Black guy to being an American. It changes because the way that we have socially constructed race is different than how other people have seen race. People come here, of course, and they see things and they want me to fill this out. And, well, I don't know what this is, white, African-American, I'm from Croatia. What do I check here? And all of a sudden, they become white. Yeah, they become white.
Our foreign students tell me when they come into, first they're faced with that immigration at the border, and they don't know what to.
Yeah, because they've not been socially constructed. We all have been socially constructed, which means that we're carrying the water down. We keep passing this down, generation to generation to generation. And they keep buying into it because this is what we've given, what's been given to us. But yet, We don't even understand it. No, but that we do. So, here I go. Where do I begin? Let's talk about race and species. That's the first thing to break down. And so I'm trying to break down the way that we've been socialized and try to simplify it into the way that it actually just is. So race is a system, the way to classify human beings, you know, in terms of the way it has been constructed. And scientists have looked at classifying human beings as if they were flowers or, you know, fruit or vegetables and things like that. You can put us on a, you know, a grocery store shelf and we can go pick out where the beans are and, you know, where so on and so forth. It has no biological basis whatsoever. You know, organisms that can mate and produce offspring are classified under the same species category. We are all the same species, period. Period. If two life forms, you know, are genetically so different and cannot provide offspring, then they're different species. They're different species. There are differences amongst them. So once we get to that point, we can just simplify this. You start to think about it, or if you start to think about it intellectually, you go, this melanin or the lack thereof in our skins, you know, what does that actually mean? Why has it come to mean anything? The genetic similarity between a human and a human, 99.9% plus. I mean, there is no other species on the planet that comes close in terms of how genetically similar we are. And so we can look around the room and we can, yes, you know, point out some differences, but that's just that 1.01 point whatever it is percent. You know, whereas fruit flies, for example, they all look the same, right? They all look exactly the same from the naked eye, right? And looking at them, but they are more genetically different than we are. So, I mean, if our kids only knew, you know, if we only taught them well. Ethnicity, different, and race, because people often try to intertwine, you know, those two things, race and ethnicity. But ethnicity refers to those, you know, who share a common ancestry, language, or culture. The identification of a group based on a perceived cultural distinctiveness to be expressed in language, music, and so on and so forth. They have some shared commonality, you know, amongst themselves, their ethnic background, where they derive from together. And then there's those shared commonalities that they have. And whereas culture is just learned behavior, you know, broken down even within ethnic groups. You know, although, you know, what it's easy for us to do here in America is to just look at people and then categorize them and say, oh, they're Black. So they all must share all of these same, you know, similarities. And culturally, though, they probably could not be more different. Someone who is of darker complexion raised in northern Vermont is going to be culturally different than someone who was raised in southern Louisiana of the same, you know, skin complexion. And the same goes for anybody else. You know, it even goes down to the block that you were raised by, you know, to the churches that you go to. That these are cultural things, you know, that are out there. And then we just adopt those, right? And we can opt in and opt out of culture. We can opt in and opt out of culture. You could be raised in a certain culture, and then all of a sudden you move somewhere else. And you can literally begin to evolve, you know, and pick up, you know, other, you know, cultural characteristics, if you will, become acculturated. You know, kind of like we almost force people to do, no matter where they're from, once they hit the US, right? Starting with that box, tech one. It's your journey to the acculturation process. Watch the magic happen. So, the complexity of whiteness. The history of white people and whiteness, is certainly complex and should be examined by all. The construction of whiteness in the United States is quite unique. It has transcended and shaped every generation, but yet few Americans fully understand the North. And it continues to shape generations, but yet people don't fully understand. Race is not biological, but yet it's quite real. We give it meaning. We begin to give it meaning in the way that it has shaped, the United States, for over 400 plus years, and has shaped the world somewhat, over the last 5 centuries, medically, mentally, educationally, socioeconomically. Who you are in terms, of the melanin or lack thereof in your skin in this country has been shaped by policies created around whiteness. It has not been created around anything else except that, a dominant white culture. And in particular, in the early beginning, right, it was shaped by a wealthy, predominantly white male culture, right? And then you had to be of a certain whiteness to even be a part of that Anglo or Saxon, because Slavs and Celts and so on and so forth were seen as different things, a different kind of whiteness. Whiteness would change over time in this country. It has not always been what it is. Nell Painter, talks about in her book these 5 phases, of whiteness in the United States. Beginning with, the scientific, parts of it. You have to have something to embed it in the minds of people, and it has to make sense. And science at its time helped that out. Again, we were talking about the technology, the chat GPT earlier, if it's used, appropriately, what it could be, inappropriately, what it could be. And the same thing with the internet and so on and so forth. It's the same thing with any science at any time. How are they going to use it? Will it be swayed? Where their biases come in? So she talks about the Enlightenment period, skull measurement period. The mid-18th century, 2 white races, Anglos and Celts, shared the territories, the massive impoverished movement from Ireland. American scholarship, this 3rd phase from the first quarter of the 20th century, where she outlines 3 white races, led to the curtailment of immigration from Eastern and Southern Europe. They were stigmatized as alien races based on their intelligence and skull shape. Irish was accepted as the American, as Northern European Nordic. Jews, Italians, Greeks, and Slavs, as degenerate. At the same time, eugenics were beginning to come into play as well. Don't interbreed with certain people, because you're going to pollute, the white race. And so they started calling those of less whiteness degenerate. And you can't in eugenics. Well, we know who borrowed that and took it to a whole new level. And that's exactly where the ideal derived from for the Nazis, this land. And history doesn't talk about that very much. I imagine, we don't want to tell that story. We don't want to say, hey, they borrowed that, from here, The American political economy during and after the New Deal in World War II, the development of the suburb, so where we live today and how it was structured with redlining, basically residential apartheid, who can move in, who cannot move in. And all at the same time, you're shaping the economic, futures of people forever. The likelihood of someone escaping or moving out of their socioeconomic level in the United States is very small. So if you whichever quintile, if you broke it down to 5 quintiles, and from the highest quintile, the likelihood of someone moving upward is like really, really tiny, based on a number of things. How are our communities structured? The availability of technology, good school, or even social capital. I'd imagine the social capital around this table right now is quite great. you know, if a young person who belongs, you know, to this affiliate, they have a lot of people that they can lean on, you know, to offer them information, to offer them other people, to offer them other opportunities. But if we travel 35 minutes west, you know, 35 minutes southwest, and look at a room that's surrounded, you know, they're not going to have as much as what's in this. You know, people from all different types of backgrounds and skill levels and education levels, and just the people that we even know. That's social capital. And we overlook that. You know, where is someone from rural, you know, Kentucky going to find that social capital? Where's someone from, you know, the south side of Chicago going to find that social capital? See, it's regardless of race at some point, it becomes a socioeconomic, you know, aspect of things too. But we get blinded by, it's just race. Class probably plays a much, you know, different role or bigger role than what people realize. So the political economy. Think about what she says there. Children and grandchildren of what was once alien and degenerate races were now hardworking white Americans. They began to morph, you know, and be allowed in. So the question becomes, and why? Why at that time? What happened? You know, that became, you know, something that was accepted. And then the remaking of race in the early 21st century, where she says after the end of legal segregation and in the midst of renewed immigration, heavily from Latin America, African, Latin American, and Caribbean breaks down the US Census category data and Black identity and contributes to immigrant mobility into Black identity. Black may still be a signal of being poor, but not to the extent that it once had been. And as Black becomes less obvious poor, white becomes less privileged, which is a very threatening thing to people. And you see a pushback, you know, because you're starting to break down things economic. You start to break down things educational. You know, the more and more people become aware intellectually, and the more inclusive they are allowed to be part of the economy and start to move. And now you're bringing in more immigrants, you know, from other countries who look like these people, who bring, you know, education with them and status and certain other things. We're starting to see the playing field move, and even the census is allowing people to actually check out of boxes, opt out, I call it, and then opt into other boxes. And if those are used and pushed to the masses, and now it looks like, oh my goodness, the United States is changing. You know, this color line is moving, and that's fear for some people. That's fear for some people, and it begins to generate pushback. The more we try to move away from racial identity, and then the blending of those structures, you know, that was always a fear, you know, of the masses in terms of who was in charge, taking it back to Bacon's Rebellion. And then what happened, you know, because of that. Enlightenment, the construction of white identity during the Enlightenment period, basically. It began in antiquity, and that was before the invention of race. The ideal of race began during the Enlightenment period when science replaced religion, you know, as a source of truth. You know, religion was once the source of truth, controlled the masses and the thoughts of what was true or what was not. And as science began to progress and replace that, since the Enlightenment period, you know, began, and that would become crucial to the development of race. There's never been an agreement on basically what criteria, you know, in terms of how do you really categorize, you know, what is race over time? How do we determine that? You know, what's the criteria for that? Where is that? Europeans have always been considered white, you know, for a long time, but there were layers to even their whiteness in terms of trying to even determine what that was. So Blumenbach, you know, he was the first scientist who was credited with taking a look at this. And he began to basically classify human beings because they had done so with these things with like plants, right? It was science that was beginning to categorize plants and animals and things like that. And so he said, hey, maybe we can classify human beings, because, there had been travel around the globe now, and you saw people from, say, hey, they look different, they're bipeds, but they're different, right? And they gather their food differently, and they have different, diets and clothing and so on and so forth. And so perhaps, we can find out what's the difference. And so, you have, Blumbach, who's doing this. And so the definition, body measurements, eye color, height, skulls, that because we all have these differences, it must be something, we must be different, right? And the most enduring classification came from Johann, from Blumbach. And he said, the measurements of the skull is basically where it's at. It's something, because the brain is in there. And so larger the brain, the smaller the brain, how big is your, frontal lobes and
So
so on and so
David-
forth.
I think it's very-
Actually,
What's your point?
actually, he would not be.
Oh.
Wah, wah.
You know?
There goes
It wasn't-
70 years of.
Actually, Right. Actually, the larger skulls probably were the ones that were, seen as, wait a minute, there's something going on there.
Oh, yeah.
Remember, he said he laid them out according to aesthetic preferences. He's basically giving something away. And so he had these extremities, as they say. He placed the skulls he considered ugly, the African and the Asian. Next to them was the Tahitian, and next to the Asians, the Native American, and then in the middle, Blumbach's most beautiful skull, a young Georgian woman who had been a sex slave in Moscow, where she died of venereal disease. Her beautiful skull became the basis for the name given to white people, a native of the South Caucasus Islands, between the Black and Caspian Sea. And so she was the one that inspired the label Caucasian.
It's just his idea.
Just his idea.
It's just his.
This is his idea.
So
Well,
change
it's
it.
interesting because a quick look around the room, our skulls don't seem to all be the same shape. No.
No, but because he said it and he was the scientist and, hey, I said it, therefore it must be true.
Right.
And the masses, followed along, but they came enamored with the color of human bone. Because, this pearly white or this ivory white color and, all the statues that were being built, of ivory and then they associated that with their skin tone.
Huh.
And marveled at that. There was a beauty in that. And she talks about that extensively in her book. So the science of race, arguably the greatest mistake of Western science, right? And it's based on these falsehoods. Biologically distinct races exist in nature. Oh, that's untrue. Some races were more intelligent than others. That's absurd. How do you figure that out? And then race could be classified and ranked from superior to inferior based on atavism, the shape of people, their body shape, their brain shapes, weight, height, and so on and so forth. And all of these different people, like the bottom left, the feature of, that person with their menacing and their skull shape and this oblong, chin, if a criminal was associated with that because they used to rob graves of criminals who had just been, executed or something like that. And then they would rob those graves and then use that criminal as the basis to determine, well, this is what a criminal looks like. And anything that's associated with that, shape and size, they're more likely to probably be criminal. And basically they were basing this early criminology on human beings not fully being developed.
It's phrenology too, right?
Yeah. And so Lombroso, came up with that idea that somehow you're a criminal because, or the way you act it was because you're not fully developed.
And the way you're convicted, if you look like a criminal.
Or it could be targeted, right? So we talked a little bit about this, but the development of race in America is really unique. And it was simply though, based on, the justification, you needed something to justify placing people in bondage. You needed something to justify that. And also, when you think about it, to help quell the masses. So other people, who may have not been, let's just say, allowed to be a part of the construction of wealth at that time, who were not of African descent. How do you keep them, at bay, right? How do you keep them from becoming so, angered, let's just say, to say, hey, we want a piece of this pie too. How do you keep them from, tell them that they're different. You can't be a slave. You have an opportunity to build something. You have an opportunity to own land. It won't be denied you. You just have to work for it. You just have to work for it and work hard for it. Remember, the country was colonized by the British, who brought over what with them? A class system. They brought it with them. It's not like, this was something new. The only thing that they continued here that they didn't in Great Britain was this ideal of free labor. This ideal of free labor. And so how do you justify that, in the end, this ideal that all men were created equal? And even Jefferson was pushing back on this ideal about slavery. Jefferson actually, struggled with himself. And so, people talk about Jefferson owning slaves, and yes, he inherited slaves, and he inherited the wealth of his family, which came, with human capital, right? But he also struggled with the ideal of slavery. But in the end, he gave in and was convinced at this time it's good for this thing, for where we're going. And he was convinced to go along with it, but he always knew that this would come back, to hamper probably progress if it was not dealt with. He also knew the Constitution was a document that should evolve. He even argued that. He said this should not remain at the end. It should evolve. Every generation should probably have their own Constitution.
Which is like, so many people think that's a horrible idea, right?
Yeah,
There are people like, well, but the Constitution,
it should be. This is that
right,
document, but
it's a static thing.
right.
It would
And it's-
change amendment.
Yeah, there's a reason why it's amendments, right? Things that people can do. European colonies, they use the word white to refer to people who look like themselves, and so this is important, to understand that, they didn't use it in a way to say that those people are black and they belong where they are. They actually used the word white just to refer people to say, hey, they look like that. There's this shared similarity. It became entangled with the word race, the word white did, because of slavery in America. And that's how it became intertwined. It never really had a racial, connotation. It just was something that said we share a trait, right? But once it came to America, it began to be associated with race because those are the people who can be enslaved. And then you have to start tying things to that enslavement to basically, prove that, yeah, they belong where they are. They're feeble-minded, they're not capable of, being on our level religiously, intellectually, and so on and so forth. You have to find a way to justify it. The natives were, deemed as savage, subhuman African, and then all these categories that they're coming up with. So the social invention succeeded in uniting white colonists, though. And it happened because of it. Because prior to Bacon's Rebellion, whites were enslaved, along with blacks, along with Native Americans, and they actually, were able to wed and have children during that time. But they were also used, by Bacon to try to overthrow the governor and rule, this particular area. And so he said, hey, you all could be free and you can have your own land and you just work with me and let's overthrow this. And so this rebellion came about And of course, it was thwarted. But then after that, they said, we got to do something. And became the separation. This is where the separation began, where race began to be solidified. And these laws would be passed. The first anti-miscegenation law, passed because of Bacon's Rebellion, forbidding marriages between whites and blacks or whites and Native Americans, separate, move them apart, because they will push back, on what's happening here. They prohibit the manumission of slaves, meaning, you can't free them, in this state. They cannot be freed, and so they prohibited, that. And the ones who had been free were forced to leave the colony. You have to go. And then South Carolina, saw what was happening and said, hey, we better pass some comprehensive slave code. Just started, the word began to pass what was happening, what would be law. Virginia passes the first law forbidding those marriages, talked about, so it's the same thing. Another thing that Virginia did is they went back on this term here. This term basically means, in English law, the children would take on the name of the father, and they would take on, the father's station. So whatever the father's station was, the children got the same station. And so if a white man fathered children with a Native or a African woman, then those children took on the station of the father and the race of the father in this case. And so in this case, with that common law, this Virginian woman, Elizabeth Key, she was enslaved, she was biracial, and she sued for her freedom, based on that her father was white. And the court granted her that freedom based on this principle, this longstanding principle. And they said, no, we need to do away with this. And they said, now children will take on the station, in terms of race of their mother. Just like that, race change. It just changes. We just moved it with the simple act of a pen. We can change what race is now and how it's determined. Now we're just going to base it, on the mother. Which is really interesting to me because my kids still are black, even though my wife said black. Follow the law. Always pushback on what white was not. Never what white is, but what white was not. Plessy versus Ferguson, Dred Scott, who had rights, who didn't. Okay, we'll give you rights, separate though, from the rights that we have, but you're equal. Equal to what? Who knows? And so it's always pushback, Supreme Court, the law. We have to frame what white is, what white people act like. We freed this, these slaves in 1865 to get elected, actually, to, Congress, making America the first multiracial government in the world. The first multiracial government that the world ever known in America, because when black men were allowed, to actually vote, and they became, Senator Hiram Revels from Mississippi, the first black senator. Actually, the irony of him is that he actually won the seat that was held by the president of the Southern Army or of the Confederacy. Yeah, so Jefferson Davis, it was his seat that he actually, won out of Mississippi. That was irony. And then all these other black, congressmen that were elected, mayors were being elected in the South, and so on and so forth. And this was a turning point, though, because this fear that The Birth of a Nation put out, which was the first movie ever shown, at the White House, the first moving picture ever shown at the White House was this movie, and President Wilson praised it. It's just like capturing lightning, in moving pictures. And if it wasn't so awfully true, about, what was coming. And so, and you think about what's being, prepped. The law is being prepped. Now vision, we have this new vision. People are being prepped. These people are savages. They shouldn't be in our government. If you ever seen this movie, and what they were portraying in it than, what they were perpetrating. So whiteness, the racial identity of white has evolved throughout history. Initially, it referred to Anglo and Saxon people. Then, it began to move. There was a pushback and, against, what was right because of the Europeans coming over. I said, wait a minute, we got to make sure that we control this narrative, the people that were here. All these other people coming over, to get land and jobs and so on and so forth, what is white? Italians said, yeah, they are white, but they're not this white. What are Polish people? Yeah, they're white, but they're not this white. And determining, what that was. And so you look at pictures like this, and those are depictions, of Irish people, right? And you can see, that scale, is quite equal between that Irishman, and that African, that's there. And, these were the newspapers of their time, what was being written, the narrative that was being set, about who these people are. And they were not, quote unquote, all white. They were white, but they were something different, than white. And, you can see no Italians allowed, at the top there, no Irish need apply. That on the far, we gotta, the far right, we gotta, make sure that we cut off, what percentage of these Europeans can get into this country. We don't want to dilute, what we have here. On the bottom, laundress was needed first class, no Polish or colors, please. And so you can see that, this whiteness, was not all, what it is. And so these were other groups, that were certainly, not into that level. They would have to morph into whiteness, over time. And so before the 1940s, these people would never have been considered for much of anything in the country from this background, because they were not white of a certain ilk. Right, so it changes over time, depending on when and where and to whom you were speaking. Now, what happens after the 1940s? Why would prior to the 1940s, this become, a thing? Well, a couple of things, are going to happen. A couple of things are going to happen, but the Supreme Court would weigh in once again about whiteness because science had been so advanced, and anthropologists, basically were saying, Asian people are Caucasoids. Asian people are Caucasoid. They have similar skin features, hair, and so on and so forth, the region of the world in which they derive. And so these two cases, actually, I don't know if you've heard of these two cases before, some of you may have or not, but they were very important in terms of the narrative of whiteness. And the Supreme Court in 1 year, 1923, basically rules, in one case, that you were ineligible because, though you are deemed Caucasian anthropologically, you were not white like European descent. And then it began, or in 1922, they start with this ideal that, you cannot be, white, even though you're holding high caste Hindus to be free white persons, naturalized, you were still, not Caucasoid. Just that 1922. And then 1923, when science approved, say, no, they're Caucasoid. And now this other, Asian says, hey, you said in 1922 that you had to be Caucasoid and recognize we are Caucasoid. And they said, oh, no. Wait a minute, wait a second. Although you may be Caucasoid, scientifically, we will determine what white is and what white is. You still are not deemed, what white is according basically to what the masses recognize in this country. That's essentially what they were saying. I'm just putting in words, they use other words, but basically that's what they meant. So continuing on building whiteness, how do you continue to build it? Well, you begin to romanticize it. Now, you make sure the books are written about it and what white culture looks like and what white people do and how they act and so on and so forth. And Emerson, writes, a couple of books, that talks about, these things, and other books began to show as well, English traits or the races of Europe, and talking about, whiteness and what that was. So now framing it, for intellectual and framing it for the public to see. You begin to see the morphing of whiteness, and you can see, after, the Civil War, these free, blacks now, but as blacks became more free and began to threaten the status quo, you saw them being elected to the Senate, you saw them being elected to Congress and having businesses and starting to progress. Now, all of a sudden, the Irish and the Italians, and they all start coming together and say, wait a minute, we need to unite here because, something's going on. And so you can see this is a white man's government. This is a white man's government. And you're going to need allies in that, because they found out that they were not the majority that they thought they were. And then, of course, with the Great Migration, that began threatening all parts of the country. And when those Black folk began to move northward, looking for jobs and thinking that, hey, we'll be more accepted, by the Northerners, they help, free us and so on and so forth. And then they ran into those same buzzsaws, in the North. And in many cases, the violence that they endured was much worse than they endured in the South. And so why was the 1940s the turning point? Why was that the absolute turning point? Well, the Nazis in Germany were committing racist crimes. They were arguing that Jews were different racially from Germans. Jews were not Aryan. Embarrassingly, a large portion of Americans also believed that. And, people like Henry Ford, who was an ardent racist and anti-Semite, was buying into that, and Lindbergh and other people. And that presented a problem. It presented a problem in the Americas. And what the Germans were doing, how, the people who were of German descent here, and how would they be looked upon, and how would other people, of other different ilk would be looked upon. But also, remember that Great Migration. What are those Black folk bringing with them to the North? Anybody know? They're bringing something very threatening to Northern culture.
Southern culture?
No. What are they bringing with them? When they were electing themselves to Congress and things like that in the South, how were they dealt with in the South? Well, the troops were removed, right? And then their votes were suppressed and squashed, right? And then the Black codes were instituted, and then the mass incarceration of these people and the re-enslavement basically through the loophole in the 13th Amendment. But once they began to escape that and started coming north, what did they bring with them?
They knew their own ability.
You're thinking,
Guns to do things.
yeah, they did, but they brought something very threatening.
The
No.
numbers. it's organized.
What threatened the South and the South squashed it?
Freedom.
Their votes. They still had voting power in the North. They had the data in the North had not done what the South had done. South basically said, you won't vote down here. You show up at a poll down here, you'll be hanging from a tree. We'll burn you out. We'll kill your whole family. Right? North had not got to that point yet. That was a very threatening thing for Northern, because now your government could, certainly be swayed in a different direction. And in particular, Democratic Northerners were threatened, because when all these folks came, they would begin to sway, the party line, and because they were going to vote Republican. Most people, if you said that today, you're like, what do you mean Black people are voting Republican? I know your history. That's how it started. The 60s would change that. That's a whole different story, though. So, that was a key point. And so threatening those Northern white folk, we need more supporters now. We need more people, that can vote with us. And the Democrats started supporting unions, because who was in the union? all of these white folks, all these white immigrants from Europe who were not generally considered white. And they allowed them to start voting without even being naturalized as you can vote now. You're white now. You're like us now. White changes again. White changes again. And many of those folks, they were some of the most ardent racists for a couple of reasons. One, you threaten our jobs. You threaten our jobs. You're moving this way, you want our jobs. And two, I want to fit in with everybody else. And so I'm going to be, you know, you don't belong here. You don't belong. And the book, How the Irish Became White, talked about the Irish were some of the most deadly and racist people to African Americans than any other European group, proving that they were a step above, that they, you know, actually belonged. Roosevelt would do his part, and Congress would do their part during the Great Depression. You know, certainly the country, you know, needed something. Everybody, you know, was suffering, you know, economically, you know, and the New Deal, it worked for some people and not for others. You know, and it was purposely, you know, done this way. You know, it was purpose. This was not an accident. The New Deal barred blacks from working their way to the middle class. You know, it created entitlement programs that excluded them. Social Security, guaranteed housing loans, government created redlining programs to subsidize farmers and unemployment insurance. And so it protected a lot of people. Roosevelt cut a deal with white Southerners that excluded black farm workers and domestics, all largely blacks, from being eligible for these programs. And that cut off 50% of the black workers from benefit, just like that. So one, we're not going to let you into the housing market. Two, the work that you will do and do won't be covered by any of these programs. You can't get into Social Security, all of those different things. I mean, wow.
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, because the jobs in terms of like farm work and domestication, you know, Social Security wouldn't cover those because there was no way to get those into that, you know, that FICA tax and things like that needed to be collected, but they knew that. But farmers would be subsidized. The farm workers would not be subsidized, but the farmers would be subsidized, you know, through a program that's still running today, the subsidies, you know, to farmers that still lasts to this day. And I question why. Why do farmers still need to get paid to grow nothing? You know, why do farmers need to get paid? The government guarantees all your whether you grow it or not. You know, and it's right there, you know, in the Farm Bill, which is connected to SNAP benefits, right? Supplemental nutrition program. You know,
Don't
program.
Don't they say that the subsidies for farmers not planting is to keep the soil?
Well,
Because if you don't, you got to rotate crops from the one.
you have to.
And then you can't plant for like a year also.
Well, the problem was for this. Look, they can morph this definition over time too, but that was not the reason. What was happening is the farmers had so much grain and things like that that they couldn't sell back then because nobody needed it. You know, that there was no money, and these things were just, you know, rotting and sitting in places, and so they couldn't make money off of it. You know, and so the government, we're going to have to help subsidize. We'll buy all this grain from you. We'll buy it all from you, subsidize you that way. And then if there's a drought, we'll make sure, you know, that you still get paid because we need our farmers to go grow food. And then you can throw in, yeah, you have to rotate, but farmers have been rotating crops. And they had been actually trained, the money that was put into land grant institutions like the University of Wisconsin, University of Iowa. Those things were all put into place to help farmers. They started out with agriculture programs, being their biggest, you know, programs to, you know, educate those farmers' kids and so on and so forth. Well, lo and behold, who couldn't go to college? You know, I mean, all of these things and, you know, putting into place, you know, about how we're going to, you know, structure the haves and the have-nots. You know, and so race is a thing, but now policy is basically, you the one that bonds.
One of the features about farmers is that there were black farmers who were entitled to receive
Yes.
kinds
Yes.
of farm aid, and the farm aid is
Yes.
actually starting out to be sensible in many ways.
Yeah.
But what happened was that the agents who distributed and made the decisions about who needed a loan to develop their farm in this way and who needed to be saved because of a drought or a flood, simply did not distribute
Right.
to the black farmers.
It was,
And now we started some slight reparations. And a suit was brought immediately in the new courts of the United States
all
by
of that,
white farmers.
all of that is true. All of that is true. But the problem is, as they say in the country, the barn door is closed, the horse has left the door. It's too little, too late, and they did the same thing with the housing.
And
The
not only
housing
that,
loans
they're
were
fighting
supposed
it.
to be for everybody, but not everybody got it.
Right.
There were black farmers, but black farmers didn't get it.
Right.
It was the right thing to do at the right time, but the way that it happened, it excluded certain people. And that's the point, that's here. That's the point, it excluded certain people. Now the question is actually, over the last 30, 40 years, arguably, should this program continue? Should it still be as it is, as we see it? We talk about cutting subsidies through SNAP benefit, but we never talk about subsidies, to large farm corporations now who are owned by conglomerates, and not by individuals. And so, there's so many layers, to these things, but the prominent layer here is this ideal, again, of what white could get you. And if you were somebody of color, it could not get you that thing. And so that layer was there, created, our neighborhood. Everybody know what this is. These were the maps that banks used in terms of loaning practice, just of a few cities. Glen Ellen, is the way that it is. Wheaton is the way that it is. The West Suburbs, the way that they are because of this structure, that was put in place. And the wealth is concentrated out here. Can blacks move in now? Yeah, I'm here. But again, the door is closed, the horse is left, and don't use me to prop me up and say, see, we've made progress. No, I'm the exception. I'm not the rule, and we don't want it, but we don't want our children to understand and think, but they do because of the way it's presented. No, everybody had an opportunity to see there's 2 black people at your school. There's an Asian guy over here, and but it's the damage. The damage is done generationally because remember what I said. Now, where you're at is generally where you'll be, and so no matter what the good folk around the table and our thought processes are, we're not going to deconstruct what has been constructed. So what we're trying to do, I would hope, is to take the information that we do know, at least plant it in a place that it should be, which is in an education system, right? Give it to our children and trust them to go forward with it, to do the right thing. Trust them to do the right thing, but you see that there's pushback. Putting this up, oh, you're trying to make our kids, not like themselves. It's like, what? Is that the narrative that you're going to send out? That, we're going to tell our children not to like themselves? They didn't do this. We didn't do this. This is what we inherited. Now, could you imagine if you all would have had an education class, when you were growing up, that actually talked about these things? And the different decision-making that we probably would have had, as we made our way maybe into a voting booth, in terms of how we wanted our communities to be constructed, how we want our school districts to look, how we want, the curriculum, moving forward. Think about how many decisions people have made because of misinformation, disinformation, or just flat out lies, simply because they didn't know. Simply because they didn't know.
See that thing in the news this week about the woman who planted the gardens on the south side of Chicago? She planted 100,000 tulips in lots. So where a home once stood that was torn down for the L tracks and the expressway to go through. So they're all red tulips. So you can visually see the red one.
You didn't tell me about that.
Well,
You just told me tulips. Actually.
So this is the result, that we see because of segregation. And so what you're looking at there is a map, of the United States, a color line map, an ethnic map, if you will, in terms of who lives where. And so the more prominent, or the more, in the population of a specific group, that's what you see, those lines coming out. And so you can actually see where the people, are. And if you can actually find better maps, through the United States Census Tract that actually breaks it down by county. And then you really begin to see how segregated the country still is based on, how it was, constructed, through home ownership and so on and so forth, jobs but that's overwhelming. So every time they keep telling us and our kids, hey, we're becoming much more diverse. We're becoming much more diverse.
So the blue means those are all counties or districts where it's majority white?
Vast majority, yeah, right. That's what that means. And that makes sense, right? That should make sense. There's 190 million people who identify as white Americans. And about 54 identify as, from the Hispanic, Latino culture, ethnic groups, about 44 million African American. And so it's overwhelmingly a white country. When you hear these things that, whites will be the minority, what people are actually planning to see is that somehow all those other folks are going to come together and look alike. And act alike, right?
And share the same.
They've already trashed, you all, by just saying that you're all white. And it's like, wait a minute, you're leaving out, they're also Italian and they're also Jewish and they're also Lithuanian and they're also Polish. There are a number of things. To reduce them to white, you just reduce them. And
but you made a really big group.
yeah, you made a really big group. Yeah, and people make all types of assumptions, right? Somehow you're all the same. That's an assumption. But, this is what the results of that is, right? Median wealth, so you know what that is. You've seen these before. I heard something out of Boston the other day. I know we're getting to that time. I thought I would zip through it. I got to say this out. I was watching a program about Boston and housing. You just made me remember it when you talk about housing. The average median wealth of a white family in Boston, city of Boston, is $240,000. The average wealth of a black family in Boston is $8. And I was like, that number's wrong. But even the person in the documentary said, that number's wrong. He said, so I had to go find the right answer. He's like, no, that's that's right.
Is that because there's a lot of people in debt that average out anyone with any assets to such a low number?
So you said
No assets.
It's the median wealth. Basically, what it's telling you that,
there's no ownership.
not
not a lot.
zero,
Yeah.
no, it's not.
Not a lot.
Right.
There's
Right,
no,
they don't own
not only
anything.
ownership, but
Very
there's
white.
there's no pensions, there's
Mhm.
there's nothing. That's astounding. I mean, that number's astounding. That's national. That
Wealth
number's
is the
astounding,
difference between assets and debt.
you know? And so, but when you think about $8 in one city,
Generational wealth.
that's exactly what it is. It's the generational wealth, and it's the opportunity to actually get a good paying job that has, benefits and things that you can buy and so on and so
And then
forth.
there's also the systemic racism that creates inability for people,
Well, that-
like, I've read, and I'm sure we all have read many articles by Black families whose houses are appraised much lower than they
Would be if someone thought a white
whiten
person
their
was-
houses.
Yeah.
Take out any picture, family pictures, do things,
Yeah.
and all of a sudden the appraisal goes way up.
Yeah.
And,
It's generational. What we're saying is that what I'm alluding to here is that the proof is in the pudding already. It's baked in the cake. You know, it's baked in the cake that everybody's eating. They just don't know, you know, how it got into the cake. And what we're talking about, this is how the cake was made. These are the ingredients to what our cake looks like. You
How do
know,
we deconstruct that?
well,
cake?
this is what I'm saying.
Education.
What I'm alluding to and getting to the point is at the end of the day, the only way that this cake, you know, is going to be through policy. And you're only gonna have to hope though, that those policies, you know, start to look at, you know, how school districts are funded.
That's
You
the
know,
biggest thing.
how social services are put into place, you know, so families, you know, who are struggling to stay together, to raise children, you know, in an environment that is not, you know, conducive for any child to live in. You know, how are you going to do that? And the thing is that we have to hope that our kids, you know, have the information to be much wiser than the information that we were given. You know, our hearts can be in the right place, but our actions have to be louder than that. And, you know, so, you know, how do we get there? And that's the question I asked myself this morning before I came here. I said, you know, what is the purpose? The purpose is to gather this information, say, wow, you know, how come our children don't really understand it? You know, and let me continue because I'm going to tell you, you know, I dropped some lines already in the water to say one reason why they don't understand it. It's not being taught to them. It's not being taught to them. They're not being prepared to understand. They're not being prepared to actually address, you know, these concerns. When I look at poverty in America, well, what does that have to do with everything? Well, what has even poor white people vote against their own interests?
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
You know, right? And well, there's a reason, you know, and Johnson lets the cat out of the bag. You know, when, you know, he knows that he's on his way out. He knows that politically he is done because he signed the 64 Civil Rights Act, the 65 Voters' Rights Amendment, and the 67 Housing, you know, Act. And once he signed those, pushed through by Congress because he wanted those, he said, we need to do something. Our country is being, you know, decimated and torn apart. And we need to move forward politically, economically, racially, all these different things. And he knew that, but he was politically done because, you know, the other side was pounding him with this idea about crime and we cannot keep giving these people money and your taxes shouldn't, you know, go to pay for lazy folk, you know.
Sounds familiar.
Just to, but it's always been the playbook. And that's why, right? That's why Blacks started voting Democrat and stopped voting Republican, because in the 1960s, when the Southern Democrats told him, you signed these bills, the Democrats will never win the South again. And when he signed that 64 Civil Rights Act, that was the beginning of the end for Southern Democrats. It was the beginning of the end, you know, at least for progressive Southern Democrats. And so he says this in a meeting. He doesn't say this publicly. It was Bill Moyers, you know, who worked with him then, who actually put this out in the 1980s or late 80s, early 90s. He said that Johnson said this after they had went through the South through a campaign, you know, thing, and he realized he was done. If you can convince the lowest white man he's better than the best colored man, he won't notice you're picking his pocket. Hell, give him somebody to look down on, you know, empty his pockets for you. People voted against their interests. They have somebody to look down on, somebody to blame. Thinking that those people, you know, are the reasons, you know, for everything, you know, that you encounter. Education was supposed to be, you know, the new thing. And, you know, Harry Truman knew how important it was and put, you know, things together and said, look, we got to provide our kids and our next generation the opportunities, you know, to prepare, you know, to be the best citizens of the world, right? And he talks about that. And he was a strong supporter of that and of public education and supporting that, and talks about, you know, how it is the citadel of human freedom. Well, when you started educating and when people like yourself and your generation, some of you, start to be educated and enlightened, you became empowered and you became knowledgeable. I can't push you around. I can't tell you what to think. You know, I have all these free thinkers who are pushing back on some of these ideals that are not in the best interest of the country or the people of the country. And when you start pushing back on that mightily in the 1960s, this guy decided that he's going to throw his hat in the ring because he wants to run for president. And when those students at Berkeley and across the nation start pushing back on the Vietnam War, on about policies about civil rights, women's rights, gay rights in the 1960s, he said, you know, why should we pay? Why should the taxpayers subsidize, you know, intellectual curiosity? Basically planting the seed. We're in trouble if these people become enlightened. You know, the masses, you know, the government cannot do what it wants to do if the people are enlightened. Go back to Adolf Hitler
Yeah.
and what Goebbels had stated, his minister of propaganda had given him. You know, what fortune for government that the people who they administer do not think.
Right.
You know, and so, you know, he began to say, look, we need to push back on this. Well, how about the power of persuasion? You know, we need to find a way to continue to control the masses, right? How do we get to people emotionally? You know, it's their emotional state in which you want to attack people to get them, you know, to think a certain way. You know, how we've been socialized to see the world has internally and emotionally impacted us. Some of our biases get in the way of our opening our minds and imagining a world that is beyond ourselves, you know, in the borders of ourselves. Once you emotionally attach yourself to an ideal or something, you know, as Charlton Heston once said, from my cold dead hands, right? He was emotionally attached to those things. Here's a guy, you know, who was one of the, you know, the bigger progressives at one time, and liberals, if you will, you know, now, you know, becomes the poster child for the National Rifle Association because he's emotionally attached to something. And when he said from my cold dead hands, he meant it. Because he was not willing to have this intellectual discussion. Well, it was this guy, Edward Bernays, who had actually, you know, done the legwork about psychology and about the power of propaganda and getting into the conscious, you know, of someone. The conscious and intelligent manipulation of the organized habits of and opinions of the masses is an important element in a democratic society. Those who manipulate this unseen mechanism of society constitute an invisible government, which is the true ruling power of our country. We are governed, our minds are molded, our tastes formed, our ideals suggested, largely by men we have never heard of. This is a logical result of the way in which our democratic society is organized. And what he was basically getting at is advertisement. How do we get people to believe that they are actually making their own decisions, but we are actually planning those decisions for them?
And this was before Fox News.
Oh, this is well before Fox News. This is well before Fox News.
Is that 28, 19?
Right,
Yeah.
right.
Yeah.
And so he would become one of the world's first and biggest, you know, sought after people to help with advertising and selling things. He was a nephew of Sigmund Freud. Drawing on the insights of his uncle Sigmund, a relationship Bernays always was quick to mention, he developed an approach he dubbed the engineering of consent. He provided leaders the means to control and regiment the masses according to our will without their knowing about it. To do so, it was necessary to appeal not to the rational part of the mind, but to the unconscious. How do we keep saying things over and over again? Put a billboard up and something in front of them that's flashing, or say the same things, and it begins to set itself into place. And guess who picked up on it?
Yep.
He picked up on it, and he was a hero to this guy. Bernays was his hero. And he borrowed that and he used that. And that's how they said, we're going to control the masses, we're going to control the media, we're going to control the narrative, and we'll put that out there, and we'll put that out there. And Bernays talked about it. He said, yeah, they were using my book, you know, for a destructive campaign against the Jews of Germany. This shocked me, but I knew any human activity can be used for social purposes or misused for anti-social ones. And so someone over here said something, I believe it was you, about ChatGPT. And when you said that, I was already thinking that I know how Chat GPT is going to be used. It's already being used that way, you know, and this is not good. This is just simply not good.
Artificial intelligence.
Now, why isn't this good? Well, look where Americans get their source of information from. They get their source of information from the news. Many Americans look at television and look at, you know, other social media now to get information. And when you see large numbers like this, you know, and people have been conditioned, you know, previous generations to listen to this because this was the most trusted man in America. Well, there was a reason at that time why Walter was the most trusted man in America, because there was something in place. And the Fairness Doctrine was put in the 1940s after World War II because of the way that the Germans had controlled the media. And so they wanted to say, we cannot allow that to happen in this country. So the Fairness Doctrine was put into place to say, if you're going to have one person stand up, a politician, and say this, then the other side gets an equal, you know, opportunity and time to do the same thing on the same platform, And they began to look at monopoly laws. You cannot own so many mediums in so many places to control so much information. And so that was in, you know, from 1949 to 1987 that the Fairness Doctrine was in place. However, the deregulation began to happen in the Reagan years. And then, you know, he deregulated part of it. And then Bill Clinton doubled down on it, both parties, and just decimated, you know, the Fairness Doctrine, right? So it no longer exists now. And now multimedia companies, you know, can buy up as much as they want. They can buy up and own as much as they want to a certain threshold before somebody accuses them of having a monopoly. But essentially, they already have a monopoly. You know, and if people are getting their information, 95% of the general public, think about crime and how crime is being produced, some of the things I talked about last, then they're going to support policy, you know, that make it look like there's something happening that isn't, you know, but what else can we control? You've seen some of these companies, right? You know who some of these companies on the screen are. You've heard of AT&T, but what does AT&T own? You know, CNN,
Oh,
Disney, we know what they own, you know, ABC. Comcast has their, you know, signature in there. National Amusement, you know, that's CBS, right? And News Corp is Fox, but that's not the only thing they own. They own book companies, they own, you know, social media outlets, they own streaming services. And so they're controlling a lot of what people read, what people think, what people see and imagine. Think about that. That's 5 companies that own over 80% of all the media that people see.
You know, used to, you could not do that, correct?
Well, that's why that
The
when
Fairness
the
Doctrine.
Fairness Doctrine, and they
So
began
that's-
to
That was the
Right.
thing, if that went by the board, then they were able to.
open the floodgates. It
That
opened the
would never,
floodgates.
that would never come back.
And you're right, and it's just right under the threshold, all of this, of not being monopoly, because they're basically saying, we're not a monopoly, there's 5 of us. There's 5 of us, there's competition out there. That's a monopoly. Just 5, controlling that much information, right, of what people see, what people watch. And then you have this, right? You have our internet that's not regulated at all. And anybody can go down a rabbit hole and stay there and live there and remain in their own echo chambers and keep hearing over and over again. So this is the direct threat to the education of your kids, right? Your grandkids, their kids, because these things are teaching them. These things are in their lives. This is the media that's being thrust at them, and they're going, this is what I see, this is what must be happening. It has to be. And over and over and over again, right? It's the same playbook. It's the same playbook. And now we're even questioning, anybody know who that is? That's Rachel Dolezal.
That's
Ever
the
heard of
one-
that name?
Yes,
This is a woman, this is a by birth, someone who would be identified, and I'm using the term, as a white female.
and
But
she-
for all practical purposes, she lived a lot of her adult life, let's say, as a black female. She lived it. And she was, working in NAACP, she was doing, for all practical purposes, culturally, she lived her life as a black woman until her family outed her, her mother and father outed her, right? And everybody got upset. And I actually looked at it and said, she exposed all of us.
Yeah.
She exposed all of us. And what she exposed is an ideal that I can live for a decade plus as a black woman, and people treat me whatever black women are treated like, and so on and so forth. And I never came out of that character, if you will. I'm using that, not her language. I'm just saying what people saw this as. But this woman truly lived culturally as a black woman. Who says besides the world that she's white, besides America? And what is white? And what is black? He basically exposed us. He exposed us, for how shallow we are intellectually and understanding that it doesn't mean anything until one of us give it a meaning. It doesn't mean anything how someone sees you, or how they see. What means something is how I see myself and how I live my life. But yet all of you can alter that. And I can alter that by adding other labels to it. And then once people have given those labels meaning, now all of a sudden my house isn't as valued as much. Now all of a sudden I'm seen as a threat. Just simply based on from whatever one neighborhood to the next, it changes depending on who I meet in the street. I walk into your office, you give me a job. I walk into his office and he doesn't. Maybe has a lot of underlying things as to why that is. Two different people who can see me in two different ways, just based on who they are, how they've been introduced to the world, based on the structure of whiteness that has evolved over time, has impacted all of your life. The languages maybe that some of your ancestry maybe once have spoken that you never even knew. Cultural things that they have shared that have just gone by the wayside because they've had to be pressured into, changing their last names, losing their language just to fit in, right? The trauma of that. And then being socialized into a world that we have just now said that that's normal. This is who we are, but is it? Is it who we are? There's a lot of people sitting on the sideline. This group should be much larger and even much more diverse than what it is, But King talked about apathy in his letter from the Birmingham jail to a lot of white clergymen and the people who sat in their pews. And that always has struck me because there's three things that actually are a threat to the progress that we all in this room are trying to make. It's fear, and it's apathy, and it's places. And they are the silent partners in the persecution of people for being different, non-compliant, free thinkers, and progressive, right? And this information, that we have discussed here today, is information basically that should be in textbooks. They should be in discussions that young people are having. They should be allowed to shape their own futures, not to be socialized, into, the past that we all have wandered out of, And so, yeah, this is a great, start, it's a good group. But what happens next is how do we get this information actually into those real foundations in our society that actually impacts the way that our kids and our grandkids, see themselves and allow them to think and imagine and remain to be curious rather than to just begin to assume things, that have been just thrown at them over the course of their lives. But this idea of whiteness has a long history that few people know. And a lot of people have been robbed of their past, of their parents, of their grandparents, of their great-grandparents, and reduced simply to a label known as white. And that's all it is. It's a label, just like the other labels that we put.
How are we doing in our local public schools with, the new history, which includes truth?
I have no idea of that. You put includes truth in quotes.
It's controversial. The
uh,
last school board election went on, and they had all these coded references to,
Yeah,
I wokeness.
there's a, and
Right.
those terms are going to continue to be used because the fight now, the battle is, how can we muddy these waters?
Yeah.
You know, how can we muddy them in which no one, you know, or nothing ever gets done and there's no progression? How can we keep both sides, you know, at each other, you know, like this? Because when that's happening, the status quo remains in place. You know, it's hard. People are emotionally attached, and that's, you know, and that was the ideal. Let's get them emotionally attached. I mean, think about, you give people, there's a whole discussion around the ideal of information. And people think that they're only given two choices, right? And not realizing that both those two choices are leading them to the same slaughter box. But anyway, you know, and that, you know, you're doing this, but you're all still going in that same direction.
Second
How do
question,
we take that out?
the second question I have, where in the world is a place that is tolerant and that people live together without these issues? Is there one?
The moon.
The moon.
The moon.
No matter,
Mars.
when you, will it be religious persecution in some place? Will it be gender persecution in another place? You know, is it a class system that's in another place, and so on and so forth? I don't think the idea is where in the world, you know, is that. It's where in the world is our courage? Where in the world is the rest of us? You know, instead of arguing, we have to get something done. You know, we have to introduce people to common sense.
And it's difficult to impact policy. Like you said, you know, so much of this is in policy and, you know, as just like a regular citizen, I can vote, but in terms of really impacting
I think the
and
biggest,
changing
the
policy.
biggest impact is locally. I think too many people look nationally.
Mhm.
The biggest impact is locally. And there are some political operatives who knew that 50 years ago. And they start beginning planting seeds in your school boards because they knew that's where you were most, vulnerable.
Road
You
commission.
know, what are you leaving to bear? While you're thinking that, oh, I'm thinking about my federal taxes and I'm thinking about the Constitution and, you know, I'm thinking about, you know, abortion, I'm thinking about gun control. And all the while you have people controlling what's going into your children's minds, you know, or the lack thereof, and teaching them how to remain their curious selves. We allow our children to be lined up every morning and marched into a classroom and sat in a place and said, sit there and listen to this. You know, we're going to fill you rather than fulfill you, your potential, by saying, let's get creative today. Let's let you do what children naturally do, you know, which are being, you know, curious. They're curious. They want to know, but they need people in front of them, you know, that actually fuels that curiosity and allows that to expand rather than saying, you know, hey, remember, this is going to be on the test. You're going to need to know what that is at the end of the day. And we've let that go. And so locally, the school boards are really important, right? Then your state, you know, Board of Education is really important, you know, and so we have to find a way to get those grassroots back where people know their neighbors and say, hey, we live next to each other. Our kids play together. You know, our primary purpose should be to make sure that their futures are, one, secure, two, bright, but three, that allows them to be who they are. Let them be the human beings who they are, rather than trying to coddle them in a place and push them in a direction.
Thank you, Theo. Our Zoom has to end. And get ready for our bishop visit, which means. break
I will
down
help
this
you.
table.
Thanks for.
Can I just say, can I just say real quick, I just want to thank, this is Kim Reed. I just want to thank Dr. Darden for coming back and talking to us. And I see again that we can just go on for hours and hours. So I'm sorry I couldn't be with you in person. Thank you all. Bye.